Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very thrilled to have with us Steve Gillon, who is the author of a new fascinating book, The Pact, which details the Clinton administration's attempt to work on putting Social Security in a bipartisan manner front and center of the national agenda. And we're lucky to be joined by Chuck Blahous and Ed Lorenzen, who are two of the most insightful insiders on this issue, as you will certainly see. And our own Mark Goldwyn, who works here at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the New America Foundation, and has written a detailed paper and extensively on the recent Bush administration's attempts to move Social Security forward as well. So Mark is going to open this discussion and moderate it and lead all of us through a detailed question and answer period. And thank you again for coming. I am sure that you'll find this is a panel that can make what sometimes can be a dry numbers topic very fascinating, and the story of this should be interesting for everybody to hear more about. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks very much, Maya. Thank you, everyone, for coming. As Maya mentioned, I work here in the New America Foundation in fiscal policy, which means that while the other programs are coming up with exciting new ideas like universal health care and child savings accounts, we're sitting and scheming about ways to raise people's taxes and cut spending on them. So needless to say, this doesn't make us the most popular program at New America, just like trying to reform Social Security doesn't make you the most popular politician in Washington. Social Security, as we know, faces a serious long-term shortfall, and those who have tried to reform it, either by raising taxes or by cutting benefits, have often seen those reforms result in failure. In fact, Presidents Ford, Carter, Reagan, Clinton, and Bush have each tried and failed on multiple occasions to reform Social Security. There have been two successful reforms, one in 1977 and one in 1983. They had at least three things in common: a crisis, a commission, and a compromise. I called them 3 Cs. In 1977, Social Security was going to grow at an unsustainable rate that couldn't possibly be afforded. President Carter largely relied on the most recent Quadrennial Advisory Council, and ultimately he had to give up some of his more progressive proposals, such as lifting the cap for employer contributions, in order to get something through Congress. In 1983, the Social Security Trust Fund was within 4 months of bankruptcy. President Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill to start the so-called Greenspan Commission in order to devise a plan to reform Social Security. And ultimately, President Reagan had to accept tax increases, while the Democrats had to accept benefit cuts. I think President Bush really understood this paradigm, this crisis commission compromise paradigm, when he tried to reform and add private accounts to Social Security in 2005. He had a supposed crisis, the $4 trillion long-term shortfall of the Social Security system. He had a commission, the President's Commission to strengthen Social Security reform, and he had a compromise, which he called progressive price indexing. Unfortunately, the ingredients weren't really there fully. Yes, Social Security faces a serious long-term shortfall, but it's currently running the largest surplus of its history, and so calling it a crisis is probably a little bit of a reach. Yes, he appointed a bipartisan commission, but all of the members were appointed by President Bush, and there were a number of mandates, such as they had to include private accounts, and they weren't allowed to propose any tax increases. And yes, he had a plan which might appeal to some moderates and liberals, but it wasn't a compromise. It was made unilaterally, since the Democrats were unwilling to deal with President Bush until he took private accounts off the table. Interestingly enough, though, President Clinton really did have these ingredients. His crisis wasn't a really traditional one. He had this huge upfront surplus and no way to save it for the future. It's a crisis we'd like to have, grant you, but it's an action-forcing mechanism nonetheless. He had not one commission, but at least 4 Social Security commissions on which he could base his reform efforts. And little did anyone know at the time, he had a compromise, not forged with moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, but with his political adversary, Newt Gingrich, and in secret. We're joined today by Stephen Gillon, who revealed the details of this secret deal for the first time in his new book, The Pact, available for sale outside or at a bookstore near you.
I love that. Finer bookstore.
Right, exactly. Stephen Gillon is the resident historian at the History Channel and a professor of history at Oklahoma University. We're also joined by 2 men who were deeply involved in the bipartisan reform efforts of the 1990s, Chuck Blahous, who worked for Republicans Senators Simpson and Gregg, and Ed Lorenzen, who worked for Democratic Congressman Charlie Stenholm. Currently, Dr. Blahous is the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, and Ed Lorenzen is the Senior Policy Advisor to House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. I think this promises to be really an interesting discussion, not only of what happened in the past, but on how we might move forward to solve some of the nation's biggest long-term problems. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Gillon. Steve Gillon.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I always appreciate it when I get a nice introduction. I've
I've had some bad experiences in the past. I was living in England back in the early to mid-'90s, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the State Department would send me around. I teach American history and American politics, so the State Department would send me around to these various Eastern European countries to talk to them about American democracy, and I was in Estonia. I spent a week teaching at the Estonian School of Diplomacy, and I was introduced by someone, and I assume it was simply a matter of translation, because he introduced me as the author of a number of forgettable books in American history, which, was probably true, but it's not something you want to be reminded of before you're about to give a speech. My role here today is really to set the table. I will confess to you up front, I am not an expert in Social Security, and actually I came about this discovery of this deal between Clinton and Gingrich by accident. So Social Security, the Pact, as the book is called, was not the original focus of the book. But what I want to do is talk about what this relationship was and what the general outlines of this pact were back in 1997, talk a little bit about those conditions and how things have changed since. But I'm really going to turn it over to our experts on the panel to talk in greater detail about Social Security and the crisis that it faces today. The book, when I started this book, it was really a book about Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, and I was going to use them as metaphors for the partisan divide in America. Why is America divided between blue states and red states? And what better way of doing it than looking at two of the central figures of the 1990s? And that's what the book started as. And as I was doing my research, the speaker was very generously gave me access to his private papers. As far as I know, I'm the first person to get access to those papers. They're housed at West Georgia State University. I was doing this research, and at one point I came across notes of a meeting that took place in the Treaty Room of the White House on October 28th of 1997. And there were about 5 pages of fairly detailed notes of this conversation between Clinton and Gingrich. As I was reading through it, sometimes when you get a document, if you're a reporter or you're a journalist or a historian, you come across a document, you're reading, and you think, wow, this is important. And it started out, it was a meeting that was originally designed to wrap up some of the final details of the budget. And they were talking about, and what was fascinating to me was everyone who I had spoken to in the White House had told me how Newt Gingrich was a different person in private than he was in public, that he was much more accommodating in private than he was in public. And here in this meeting, you see Gingrich and Clinton really working together to try to, as they were saying, to try to kick problems down the road a little bit, to try to avoid having to confront things in the budget. And then they turned their attention to this big issue. Both men wanted to do something. They wanted to leave a legacy, and they're both thinking about their legacy at this point and what they could do. And they believed, and it's something I refer to it as generational envy. This is the time when Tom Brokaw's book came out about the greatest generation. You have Saving Private Ryan. And I think for the baby boom generation, there's a sense of what are we going to do? What's our contribution going to be? And I think for Clinton and Gingrich, they both believed that their generational contribution was going to be to solve the problems of entitlement. They had, in August of that year, signed the balanced budget bill, and surprisingly, they saw their numbers go up. I mean, it's the two guys we know. When you think about Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, you think about the budget shutdown and these very contentious public debates that they had. But what happens after 1996 and 1997 is there's a whole new dimension to the relationship that most of us, at least I knew nothing about, where they realized that if they were going to leave any kind of legacy, they needed to deal with each other. Clinton had 3 years left as president. He believed that Gingrich was going to be speaker for those years. Gingrich had already term limited himself. He was going to leave in 2002. But he believed, too, that if he was going to have any chance of leaving a significant legacy, to be not just a revolutionary but a reformer, that he was going to have to deal with President Clinton. And they decided that the legacy they were going to leave was to try to address the problems of Social Security. These discussions begin after the signing of the balanced budget bill in August of 1997. The key person in the discussion is Erskine Bowles, who was the president's chief of staff. And when I was doing my interviews, Gingrich would make these vague references about how he and Clinton had these big plans and how 1998 was going to be this great year of reform that would be equal to that of the Great Society or the New Deal, but I could never get a sense of exactly what it was. And once I had these notes, I realized what it was. So I called Erskine Bowles to try to get the White House perspective, and he said that he never talks to anyone without getting the permission of the president first. So he talked to the president, showed the president the notes, and the president gave him permission to talk to me. And what I was struck by in the course of doing the story was how the story from both sides was nearly identical. How the White House perspective on this story is nearly identical to the perspective on the Republican side. And the Republican side, it's primarily Newt Gingrich and to some extent Bill Archer. So in this meeting that takes place in October of 1997, there's this one exchange which I just thought was so fascinating, where they're talking about Social Security reform, about doing something really big, something transformative is a word that Newt Gingrich likes to use a lot. And it was going to be Social Security reform followed by Medicare reform. Although Medicare reform, they're going to put on a slower track. I thought that was going to be even more complicated than Social Security. And at one point, Erskine Bowles turns to Gingrich and he says, so we're partners now. And Gingrich says, I prefer to say we're a coalition. And for him, that was an important distinction. They were still going to fight on certain things, but on this big budget, big issue, they were going to work together. And the general plan was that Clinton was going to announce a major overhaul of Social Security and State of the Union address in January. And Newt Gingrich was going to follow with some positive comments, and then he was going to send it to Bill Archer, who was also going to be involved in this, and they were going to push through a reform package. A few months after Clinton meets with Gingrich, he sits down with Bill Archer in the White House. It's the week between Christmas and New Year's. We couldn't figure out exactly what day it was, but Archer tells this funny story about how he wanted to talk to the president about taxes. But the president really wanted to talk to him about his Social Security thing. But Archer had about a 15-minute presentation that he was determined to give, and I think it was early in the morning, and he said Clinton looked really exhausted. His face was kind of swollen. He had bags under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept. And Clinton sits down, and Archer went into his talk, his 15-minute talk, and a few minutes into it, it looks to him as if the president's almost nodding off. And when Archer finishes, Clinton sits up in the chair and responds to every single point Archer made in the exact order that he made them. And as he was leaving, he turned to an aide and he said, I'd never want my constituents to hear this, but that's the smartest man to occupy the White House since I've been alive. Clinton sort of had that effect on people. So what was it then that they were talking about, and how was this going to play out? There was, I think, in this time, and I think both Chuck and Ed will be able to talk about this in greater detail. There was, it seems to me, a policy consensus that was forming around certain basic ideas. What happened after this meeting for the next year, the White House, mainly Gene Sperling, and from the Republican side, Bill Archer had a committee that were working independently of each other to come up with what they believed would be an appropriate compromise and a reform package. They came together in December of 1998 now, right after the elections. And they were shocked at how close together they were. And there are a lot of important details that needed to be worked out. But what they agreed on was that there had to be an increase in the age when people received full benefits. There was going to be issues of taxes, probably taxes on higher income. Clinton had promised both Gingrich through Erskine Bowles. By this point, Gingrich and Clinton rarely met together. They communicated through Erskine Bowles. They didn't trust each other, but they both trusted Erskine Bowles. And Gingrich told me that he didn't believe anything Clinton told him, but if Erskine Bowles told him, he believed it. But Clinton had told Bill Archer that he would provide political cover for Republicans who were willing to get behind a compromise plan. The other big piece of this, and the one that I think was most significant, was that President Clinton had also signed off on the concept of private accounts. There was, both Clinton and Gingrich were willing to make big compromises. Gingrich was willing to break with the mainstream of the conservative wing of his party, which wanted the surplus to be used for tax cuts. And instead, he was willing to support the president and allow the surplus to be used to buy into Social Security, whatever Social Security package they came up with. Clinton, his compromise was to support some form of private accounts. Now, the question was, what were those private accounts going to look like? The White House, they believed that the only way it was going to be politically feasible was to have private accounts on top of Social Security and to use the surplus to help fund that transition. It's unclear, we'll never know whether the general outlines that they were discussing were ever going to be realized, whether it was going to be politically possible to make this happen. Paul Blahous said to me at one point, he said, no one ever lost money betting against Social Security reform. And there were a lot of significant details that needed to be worked out. There were a lot of complicated politics also to be worked out. Many people in the White House questioned whether Gingrich could bring his party along, especially the conservative wing of his party. Gingrich, a lot of Republicans worried whether Clinton could bring enough Democrats along, knowing how forcefully House liberals in particular would oppose this. The question was the model for this going to be NAFTA or fast track? Was Clinton going to be able to get the 100 Democrats that he felt he needed in order to get this thing through? But there are in many ways, the stars were aligned for something to happen. And the biggest sort of factor in this, in making this possible, was abundance. It's hard to imagine. It was 10 years ago. In 1997, it was the first balanced budget in 30 years. There was, I think, a $74 billion surplus projected for 1997, and over 15 years it was projected to be over $4 trillion. Now, those numbers obviously are inflated and they weren't realistic, but those were the numbers that people thought they were dealing with. So this added revenue made possible a compromise package that would still be painful, but less painful than it would have been under other circumstances. And also, the whole idea of private accounts, Wall Street's booming. America, in 1997, the economy grew by 8.2%. People were watching their IRAs grow in ways they had never seen before. So there was greater support, public support, for the idea of private accounts, of allowing people to put money into the stock market, having options other than the traditional system. And there were polls in 1997, 1998 that showed young people in particular supported these initiatives in significant numbers. But I think the other sort of factor that comes into play are these two men. You have two politicians. Whatever you think of, whether you're a liberal, you're a conservative, whether you like Gingrich or Clinton, there's two guys who are doing what you want your leaders to do. They're willing to take risks, to achieve some long-term significant reform. And they also are willing to fight against the liberal and the conservative wings of their own party. Now, Clinton, what's interesting about this meeting that takes place in October of 1997, there's no member of the House Democratic leadership there. At the meeting it's Bill Clinton, Erskine Bowles, John Hilley, who was the White House congressional liaison, and for the speaker, it was Speaker Gingrich and his chief of staff, Arnie Christensen. There were 5 people. There was no other Democrats in the room. And the reason was that Clinton knew that, especially in the House, he was much more confident about the Senate, where he had closer ties with Daschle, with Trent Lott. You had major figures like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who were John Breaux, who were in favor of this. He thought the real battle was going to be in the House, and the biggest battle was going to be with the liberal wing of his own party, and primarily Richard Gebhard, who in December of that year gave a very critical speech at the John F. Kennedy School about the new politics and the approach the Clinton administration was taking, and had blocked the fast track in the fall of 1997. Clinton didn't even tell his own vice president. He feared that Al Gore had no reason to support private accounts because he knew that it would enrage the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and the most likely challenge he was going to face in 2000 was going to come from Gebhardt. He didn't tell his own wife, who went on to have a career of her own, which we won't talk about here. So Clinton is creating this, and he's working behind the scenes with blue dog Democrats to moderate Democrats, bypassing the liberal wing of his own party. Gingrich is doing the same thing in his party. He's bypassing the conservative wing of his party that's all in favor of tax cuts, and he's in a very tenuous political position. Remember, there was an attempt to overthrow Gingrich as Speaker the previous summer. A lot of conservatives felt that he had gone soft on the president, and he wasn't as confrontational. He was trying to make too many deals with the president. But Gingrich, despite that considerable political risk, was still willing to reach across the aisle and to make this happen. And one of the things I know we'll talk about where we are today and how things have changed, and I think they've changed significantly in the past 10 years. But as an historian, when we think about great reform movements, we think about party systems and about parties that dominate politics. You think about the Democrats. I mean, it's the Democrats in the New Deal, massive majorities in the House and the Senate under control of the White House, and the same thing with the Great Society in 1964 and 1965. But I think the possibility of Social Security reform was made more likely because of divided government. Because both sides, at 1997, they both had a buy-in. They both, I don't think either Clinton or Gingrich would agree with this, but I think there was an implicit assumption on Clinton's part, and I think Clinton and Gingrich shared the assumption that the Democrats were going to control the White House. That given the prosperity and Clinton's high ratings, that it was going to be difficult for the Republicans to mount a challenge to Al Gore in 2000. At the same time, I think Clinton believed that the Republicans were going to retain control of Congress and certainly the House. So it gave them, they had an incentive to go against the extremes or the liberal or conservative factions of the party and try to create some political common ground, some middle ground, some centrist coalition. And everything in Washington, as all of you know better than I, works toward polarization, works toward pulling things apart. But what you had here are two politicians who were going against the center of gravity of their individual parties. Clinton, who had always been, Clinton, his whole career was about moving the Democratic Party closer to the center. We don't think of Newt Gingrich that way, but in many ways, by 1997, Newt Gingrich is doing exactly that. He's trying to move the Republican Party away into a more reformist mold, working out compromises, trying to achieve legislative victories with the president. So I think that's another condition that made Social Security reform more likely in 1997 and 1998. Since then, almost all those conditions have changed. And of course, all the stars may have been aligned in 1997 and 1998, but no one anticipated, the thong that changed the course of history. And it was really the Lewinsky scandal. Sorry about that. It was the Lewinsky scandal that if this had any chance of succeeding, it was destroyed when the Lewinsky scandal broke out. Because what the Lewinsky scandal did was to empower the very groups that opposed reform. It limited Newt Gingrich's ability to maneuver and to negotiate because it outraged the right wing, the conservative wing of his party. At the same time, and I think even more significantly, what it did was it forced Clinton into the arms of the liberal wing of his party, the very wing of his party that he was negotiating around in order to do this deal. Again, Paul Begala, he said that the more liberal you were, the more likely you were to support the president during impeachment. Well, and it was Richard Gebhardt. It was Gebhardt who designed the strategy of winning by losing in the impeachment battle by making the Republicans look extremist. And it was Gebhardt who in many ways saved his presidency. So the last thing President Clinton could do in 1998 was to alienate the very people who were saving his presidency by proposing a reform that included private accounts. So even though these discussions continued for another year and culminated in a conference in December, by the time Clinton held the conference, the White House conference on Social Security in December, he's holding the conference, and down the hall, the House Judiciary Committee is voting on articles of impeachment. So the possibility, any possibility of reform was dead, and it died because of the Lewinsky scandal. And I think if you look at conditions, when you think about President Bush in 2005, when he proposed Social Security reform, what was missing there was no buy-in. There was no possibility with Democrats out of power, they had no incentive to negotiate, to give up an issue that had worked so well for them in past elections. And I was struck just recently, I think it was last weekend, both Barack Obama and Senator McCain spoke by satellite to the AARP, which is sort of a major player in all this. And I was struck by, just in the general comments they made, how much closer John McCain is to Bill Clinton's position on Social Security, at least in terms of the sort of the flexibility. And Barack Obama's position seems to be much closer to the position of House Democrats, the liberal House Democrats had been during the 1990s. But in many ways, all the conditions, now when we talk about the way the past influences the present, I know we will talk about the relationship between the Clinton-Gingrich effort at reform in 1997 and where we are today. But in my mind, we live in the world has changed so much that there's very little that we can take from the situation in 1997 and 1998 and apply it to today because the circumstances are so different. Abundance is given away to deficits. Peace is given way to, we're fighting two wars. And I think in many ways, the partisan rancor, the same thing that Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were trying to overcome, at least privately, has become so much more powerful of a force in American politics today that the center, as fragile and tenuous as it was in 1997, is even more fragile and tenuous today. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing from our other guests. Thank you.
I'd like to just begin by thanking Mark and New America for putting this panel together, and to thank Dr. Gillon as well for producing what I found to be a very gracefully written book, certainly very evocative of the atmosphere of 10 years ago. Of course, to thank Ed, my colleague from those days, for being on the panel with me. The central narrative of this book, which has President Clinton earnestly working to fix Social Security and reaching out to the congressional Republican leadership toward that end, is certainly very consistent with the perceptions that we in Senator Judd Gregg's office had at the time. I wasn't in the meetings that Dr. Gillon refers to, but I can certainly vouch that the follow-through outreach performed by the Clinton administration at the staff level to congressional staff like myself, whether it was by Commissioner Ken Apfel or Gene Sperling or Jeff Liebman or David Wilcox over at Treasury, was unfailingly constructive, gracious, inclusive. It certainly won a very large measure of trust. On the downside, I can also confirm the book's portrayal of the leftward tack that took place in the heat of the impeachment fight. Now, if you've ever seen a baseball telecast, you know what happens. It's always a sorry sight when the color commentator leaps in and starts trying to give the play-by-play. So I'm going to leave the play-by-play to Dr. Gillon. I think he does an excellent job of providing it. What I'm going to try to do to add value to this forum is to provide a little policy context for the political narrative. There's one overarching policy observation that I think is worth making, and that's simply this, that a Clinton-Gingrich accord obviously would have been enormously valuable, perhaps even an essential ingredient of a larger Social Security legislative deal. But by itself, I would suggest it would have been very far insufficient to ensure that legislation could be enacted. And now, I say this not to denigrate the considerable abilities and importance of both the President and the Speaker, nor do I say this because Social Security reform is just difficult in some abstract sense. I say this because there's evidence that there was a significant substantive gap between where the President and the Speaker appear to be heading and the policy goals of many of the Social Security reformers on the Hill. And I'm speaking here of many of the key congressional players who earnestly advocated and zealously favored a Social Security deal, but who might have regarded the product of a Clinton-Gingrich deal as worse than no deal at all. Now, on what do I base that statement? We have to remember that the Social Security problem means different things to different people. To one person, the problem could be as simple or as narrow as correcting Social Security's actuarial imbalance. And of course, this consists of the mismatch between Social Security's incoming revenue and the benefits it promises, averaged over some long span of time. That's a widely recognized problem, and it's a problem that can be solved without solving a lot of other problems that many people see. Costs that are growing faster than the underlying economy, inequities in how different generations are treated, or an accounting system that some people regard as misleading and others as downright dishonest. Now, if you talk to a large number of people about Social Security, you'll hear a large number of them describe something else as the problem that they see. They will describe the problem as being that the government doesn't save Social Security money. And we've now had many years of large Social Security surpluses, and we're soon to be facing large deficits for several decades. And the government hasn't been saving the surpluses of the past to equip us to finance the deficits of the future. Now, solving the second problem doesn't solve the first problem. Even if we saved all the Social Security surpluses going forward, in fact, even if we could go back in time and save all the Social Security surpluses of the past, the program would still be insolvent in 2041, according to the trustees. It's very important to understand that. And just as solving the second problem doesn't solve the first problem, solving the first problem doesn't solve the second problem. You often see people publishing tables that say, here's how much of the shortfall you correct by raising the retirement age or raising the cap on taxable wages or reducing the COLA. But these numbers don't tell us whether or not the resulting solvency is more than illusory or whether it's an accounting artifact that ignores what the government is actually doing with the money that it collects. Now, I go through this background because there is some reason to believe that a compromise agreement between the President and the Speaker might have been viewed as unresponsive to many of the problems seen in Social Security by the bipartisan Social Security reformers on the Hill. To appreciate this, it's helpful to look back at the 1983 reforms and their aftermath. Now, remember, the 1983 fix averted near-term insolvency, and it advertised long-term solvency as well, and then that was defined as solvency over 75 years. Now, the actuarial calculation on which that finding of solvency was based implicitly assumes that very large annual imbalances in Social Security, that is, huge surpluses in some years, huge deficits in other years, can simply be averaged out and netted against each other to produce a finding of balance. In fact, this path of large surpluses followed by large deficits arising from the 83 reforms is such a striking feature of those reforms that many reflexively assume that they were deliberately constructed to pre-fund at least a portion of the retirements of the baby boom generation. And I will add, they wrongly assume that. That's actually not the case. But putting aside this matter of the intent of the 83 reforms, by the 1990s, most of the bipartisan congressional reformers had concluded that the 1983 reforms were lacking in some important senses and had produced a form of solvency that was in some respects illusory. And they were determined to employ what they regarded as more meaningful fiscal tests the next time around. Now, by the time the President and the Speaker sat down together, there existed several manifestations of these concerns. Obviously, you had Senator Moynihan in 1990 just moving to cut the payroll tax outright. Now, obviously, on the surface, it would appear that this would worsen Social Security's actuarial balance, but the fact that he and many congressional allies moved to do that was a symptom of the fact that they regarded the actual solvency of Social Security as being much less than was being advertised. Similarly, President Clinton's own Advisory Council of 1994 to 96 made several unanimous recommendations that were in a certain sense a refutation of the 83 reforms. They recommended unanimously that solvency should not be something that deteriorates simply because of the passage of time, which of course was the case under the 83 reforms, and also that the program should begin to incorporate at least partial advance funding. Now, this last unanimous recommendation, of course, is a tacit admission that the trust fund buildup since the mid-1980s was not an effective source of advance funding in the eyes of the Advisory Council. Now, because no final Clinton-Gingrich deal was ever reached, we can't state with certainty what would have been its content nor its fate. But if you look at the ideas that were floated in and around those discussions, and some of them have been alluded to by Dr. Gillon, for example, the Archer proposal and the reform framework that the Clinton administration ultimately released, we see some evidence that the President and the Speaker were in something of a different place. If you look at the congressional proposals of the 1990s, you see they tend to repeat certain common elements. They tend to produce sustainable solvency, not just 75-year solvency, and they commit to fixing Social Security and retaining it as a self-financing system without relying on general tax revenues. And these proposals also generally try to smooth out the annual income and outflow of Social Security to bring it more closely into alignment on an annual basis rather than relying on a large trust fund buildup where there was skepticism as to whether it would actually be saved. But very different assumptions appear to have undergirded the Clinton-Gingrich discussions. As Dr. Gillon alluded to in his remarks, there are often references to the enormous opportunity arising from the recent presence of budget surpluses. Now, the Social Security surplus had been around since the mid-'80s, so that wasn't the recent development. The recent development was the arrival of revenues in other parts of the federal budget. Now, obviously, these can only be used to shore up Social Security if there is further agreement to start financing the program with general revenues as opposed to simply Social Security revenues. And in fact, later the Clinton administration proposed that formally. Similarly, the Archer proposal, and as Dr. Gillon indicated, there's a lot of common ground between where Archer was coming from and where the President was coming from. The Archer proposal would have funded personal accounts with general revenues as well, as distinct from most of the congressional proposals which would have funded them from payroll tax revenues. Now, the use of general revenues to shore up Social Security, whether or not the government is in surplus, is obviously a very significant departure for the program. Perhaps radical is too strong a word, but it would have been very significant. It was one that was strongly opposed unanimously by the Clinton administration's own Advisory Council and by many other key figures for some time. Social Security has been a program for decades that was designed to be segregated from the rest of the federal budget, maintaining a link between the contributions workers paid and the benefits they ultimately received. To move away from that and to start financing the program with general revenues in a sustained way would have changed several aspects of Social Security to which Americans had long become accustomed. Obviously, it would change the meaning of, in fact, undercut the meaning of the separate payroll tax collections that workers now see reported on their W-2 forms. It would sever the historic contribution benefit link, and it would certainly undercut the rationale in some respects of trust fund accounting itself. So certainly, it sounded compelling to many, this idea of using the surplus to save Social Security. But I think it's less than certain that following this concept through to its logical conclusion, meaning abandoning Social Security's self-financing structure and funding the program with significant transfers of general revenues, even if they were surplus revenues, it's not clear to me this would have been saleable on the Hill, even if the President and the Speaker had agreed to it. As Dr. Gillon indicated, there were also governing assumptions with respect to the utility of using add-on personal accounts to bridge differences between Republicans and Democrats. The idea here is that the personal account, putting that into the Social Security system, would be a lure to win the support of Republicans, but structuring them as add-ons as opposed to funding with payroll taxes might make them palatable to Democrats and to the AARP. Now, I'm not here to argue that personal accounts funded by payroll taxes, as President Bush proposed and as many bipartisan reformers proposed in the 1990s, are the only way to structure a Social Security deal, and I'm certainly well aware of the very strongly held opposition in many places to that concept. But we need to remember certain structural features of add-on accounts. By definition, an add-on account has no bearing on the underlying finances of Social Security. It doesn't change the revenues going into the traditional system, nor does it fund any of its currently projected obligations. So the add-on account is usually offered as a political sweetener, as opposed to something that substantively has an impact, at least a substantive impact, on the underlying Social Security fiscal problem. And whether the add-on can perform that political function is very much a function of what the rest of the deal consists of. If we look at the comprehensive Social Security proposals that have been put forward, the Gramlich proposal in the 1990s, and the Lieben-McGinnis-Samwick proposal more recently, these proposals that contained add-on accounts, we tend to see certain common features to these proposals. In these plans, if workers are obliged to put new revenues anywhere, they go into funding the personal accounts rather than financing the traditional Social Security system. In other words, what these proposals do is they make sufficient changes to Social Security's traditional benefit structure to fix its finances without any additional revenues to the traditional system and allow workers to put all of their additional contributions, if they make any, to the personal accounts. Now, whether congressional Democrats would have been willing to sign on to a complete Social Security fix without any additional revenues at all going to the traditional system in exchange for accounts being structured as add-ons, I'm not in a position to say, but I'm highly skeptical. I can certainly say with some confidence that Republicans would not then, nor would they now, have supported both funding the accounts as add-ons and committing additional tax revenues to Social Security so that workers are paying more out of pocket on both sides of the equation. Seen in this light, I think the political utility of an add-on account is far less than many have tended to assume. Now, I've just given you several reasons why reform in the 1990s would have been a tall order, even if there had been a Clinton-Gingrich deal. But in closing, I would just like to reinforce my fundamental agreement with Dr. Gillon's picture that the late 1990s represented a unique moment in time and a precious opportunity to fix Social Security that tragically slipped away. Some of the reasons that I've noted here have already been mentioned by Dr. Gillon. We had perhaps an unusually favorable political alignment in the late 1990s. Obviously, as a Republican, I favor the election of Republican presidents and Republican Congresses. But there were unique opportunities that existed in the late 1990s when you had a Democratic president willing to give cover for congressional Republicans who were willing to fix Social Security. In 2005, President Bush was dealing with a narrow Republican majority, and now there's a Democratic Congress and a Republican president. And despite my partisan affiliations, I would be hard-pressed to say that that is a better environment for reform relative to the one that we had in the late 1990s, assuming that the Democratic president in question was as willing to fix Social Security as President Clinton was. With respect to another key difference, I agree with Dr. Gillon that the departure of several moderate Democrats from the scene is also significant. Some of them retired, Senators John Breaux and Bob Kerrey. Others were defeated in their reelection bids, like Charlie Stenholm and Chuck Robb. Others retired and have since passed away, like Senator Moynihan. With their departures, much of the willingness to engage in fixing Social Security disappeared from the Democratic side of the aisle. I say very hastily, present company accepted, and their bosses. But I don't think I'm being unduly partisan when I say that the departure of these reformers from the scene has made an unfortunate difference. We are also, of course, much closer to the wall now than we were there in the late 1990s. We are now just 8 years and a few months away from the emergence of permanent cash deficits. Perhaps even more importantly, we have another 10 years' worth of retirees on the rolls. There's a bipartisan consensus that we shouldn't be cutting benefits for people once they have hit the retirement rolls. So having 10 additional years of birth cohorts, especially very numerous birth cohorts like the baby boomers generation, and exempting them from participating in the solution makes reform much more difficult. Finally, I think another adverse development since then is alluded to in Dr. Gillon's book. It's the greater capacity that participants in the body politic now have to basically choose their own facts as well as their own opinions. I think you refer to this as the daily me in your, we all have the ability to get online and see facts that reinforce our own picture of the world. In the 1990s, certainly there were vastly divergent views about what should be done about Social Security, but the conversation generally took place within a common understanding of the facts at hand. There's practically a cottage industry of people now writing online dedicated to the proposition that we really don't have a Social Security problem. And I don't have the time here to go into why this is all completely groundless. But Nevertheless, there's a tremendous amount of energy that must be devoted now to documenting and redocumenting the reality of the problem, and it's obviously much more difficult to get people to agree to a solution if they can't even agree that there is a problem to be confronted. All of these factors only underscore, I think, the poignant portrait in Dr. Gillon's book, which is of a precious opportunity lost with an enormous cost to be paid by all of us, and most especially by the younger people among us and by those who will follow them. This cost was imposed as a result of the human failings of well-intended people who were trying to do right, people, of course, who are basically like us in this room, perhaps possessed of some greater talent, certainly of a lot more power, but people who shared our weaknesses, our frailties, our flaws, and our impulsive mistakes that we all make, for which we all hope to be forgiven, but in their case, whose impulsive mistakes derailed an historic opportunity. So we read the story that Dr. Gillon presents not with a feeling of superiority to the people involved, to the actors in the drama, but empathizing with the mistakes that they make and feeling the very real tragedy that results from them. It's a compelling, affecting story, and one I believe that we have great cause to regret. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank New America and Mark for putting this forum on, and Dr. Gillon for his very, very interesting book. I encourage all of you to go out and buy it and read it. It was very interesting reading, and I would concur with Chuck that although I was not privy to many of the meetings and details, that the portrait that's in the book is very consistent with what those of us who were in the middle of it saw happening secondhand. We could clearly see the results of it, and so it's a very interesting portrait of providing some of the background and helping understand the things that were happening that we were seeing second and third hand, where the genesis were coming from. Chuck likened his position being the color commentator, not doing the play-by-play. I'm now the third guy in the booth, where the color trying to find a few things to interject. But I also don't want to take too long because I do want to leave plenty of room time for questions. I must hasten to add the caveat that I'm here speaking for myself and on my recollections of my role at the time, and not in my current capacity or speaking for the majority leader. So I don't want anyone to be making assumptions about that. I think that the deal that was being talked about was a deal trying to find the agreement between the left and right, and people tend to automatically assume that a deal between the left and right must come to the middle, but that's not necessarily always the case. In this case, having Chuck and I here as Republican and Democratic participants at the time may actually provide a skewed perspective. I think Chuck and I both came from what came to be known as the Pain Caucus, a term that was actually coined by someone in the Clinton administration, probably not necessarily as a compliment at the time. We decided to take it on as one. But the motivation that those of us who were coming at it from the center for dealing with Social Security reform was trying to control the claim that Social Security made on the overall budget and overall economy, whether that, and be feeling that continuing Social Security on its current course would mean that Social Security was taking a greater claim on future resources, which would either force much higher taxes, which would be a concern for the Republicans who are part of the centrist coalition we had, or would be precluding taking away resources that would be needed for other needs, whether it be investments in education or healthcare or infrastructure. And that was the perspective that some of us from the Democratic side of the Pain Caucus brought to it. But that the perspective that we brought to it wasn't simply a matter of making Social Security's numbers add up, revenues and outgoes, but looking at how Social Security fit into the overall pie, whether we could afford to meet the commitments to Social Security and meet the other commitments that we all wanted to make. And that, I think, was a somewhat fundamental difference between much of what the discussion was going on in the late 90s and where, to some extent, where both the Clinton administration and Speaker Gingrich and Bill Archie were bringing to the discussions. I think the premise that the administration was bringing to those negotiations was that Republicans would accept a higher level of total spending and locking in a higher level of benefits for Social Security if that was done in exchange for also putting in individual accounts. And while on a macro level there's a lot of potential to that as a deal, and I don't want to dismiss that out of hand, looking at it from a fiscal perspective and from the perspective that we brought, many of us from the center brought, that you'd be taking essentially the level of commitments made under current law, which we felt were an unsustainable level, and then adding on the additional commitments for individual accounts. And to the extent all that was being done was using individual accounts as a way to leverage an agreement to maintain current benefit levels, that would be missing the fiscal goal that many of us from the center brought of trying to look at the total claim that Social Security made in dealing with the issue of priorities. That's not to say that the surplus could not have played a very important role in helping bridge some of the differences and getting part of the gap being closed. And I think, while there are philosophical differences on general revenues, I think some degree of general revenues as a way to help smooth the hard edges of a deal might have been possible. But to the extent that there was a view that the surplus could have been a substitute for making any tough choices, and that would be on its own a solution, I think in many ways was a flawed premise. And I think the best evidence of that is, from an economic standpoint, if the surpluses truly were real savings, and we weren't going to be using those surpluses for other purposes, then there would be a case to be made that that was being done. And the Clinton administration argued, and many times, many of the meetings that I would have with them, is that they were making a tough choice, and they were including some pain, because foregoing the tax cuts that people were talking about was a tough choice. And so from their perspective, using the surplus for Social Security as opposed to tax cuts was a tough choice. It was a sacrifice that was making spending. But it's not entirely clear to me, it wasn't clear at the time, and it's not even less clear to me now, that using those surpluses for Social Security would have precluded their use for tax cuts on part of Republicans, or quite frankly on other spending from Democrats. And the clearest example of that is, do we believe that we would not have enacted tax cuts similar to what President Bush proposed when he took into office otherwise? And now you see, with Barack Obama in the campaign talking about, to the extent he would be taking away some of those tax cuts that were enacted on the premise of surplus, he would be using those for spending for health care and other purposes. So whether it was really a long-term sustainable position that using the surpluses for Social Security would have truly represented savings, or whether it would have been using the surpluses on paper as a way to lock in further higher legal commitments for Social Security, only to be followed with other costs in other areas, is something we will never know. But I think the experience of the last several years suggests that simply just because we may have used the surplus for Social Security wouldn't have prevented us from using it for other purposes. One of the arcane parts of the debate at the time, that word I was using all the time but I've forgotten about, is double counting. And it was an arcane amount of accounting, but it really was a matter of the surpluses that Social Security was collecting and then contributing to unified surpluses. Were we going to credit those surpluses to say Social Security has a claim on future resources because of the surplus now, but then because it's a unified surplus, we can now credit money to Social Security again, either by using it to put into individual accounts or by putting it into the trust fund? And without rehashing the economics of the debate, what that really became a debate about is how much of future resources were going to be devoted to Social Security. And the accounting mechanisms that got there might have been complicated, but that also was a fundamental philosophical disagreement at the time. I'm going to try to cut myself short here so we have time for questions, but I will just add a couple of anecdotes from the Lewinsky scandal and how the effect that had. And actually, I have to apologize for Dr. Gillon. That's one of something I had forgotten before he interviewed Charles Denholm. There's a lot of, I think it's very true that the impeachment scandal made President Clinton much more dependent on liberals in the Democratic caucus, and therefore much less willing to go out. I don't think it is true that the scandal cost him the support of the people in the center that he was counting on for support. And actually, in some ways, the inverse was true. And one of my recollections from the time was working for Congressman Charlie Denholm at the time, who ended up voting for 2 of the articles of impeachment. The night before the vote on impeachment, Gene Sperling came to meet with him to talk about Social Security. And it became very clear to him, impeachment never came up in the conversation. He made it very clear he wasn't coming to talk about impeachment, but the subtext was, President Clinton is still interested in working on something you care about. And we want to work on Social Security reform. And if part of the message that Charlie Denholm took away from that meeting was, maybe I want Bill Clinton to stay in office because I want to work on Social Security. Well, I think Gene Sperling wouldn't have been unhappy with that. But I think it was actually the desire to work together on some of those issues was the one thing that kept the moderates with him, even though they disagreed, the impeachment scandal caused him to lose their support, their support for him politically. I think they were still even more supportive of him on policy grounds. I think the other place where the impeachment scandal undercut the potential deal was by weakening the president. It made Republicans who were already very nervous about a Social Security deal much less comfortable on relying on him for cover. That I think it is an article of faith among Republicans that the losses they suffered in 1982 were because of Social Security. It is impossible to overstate the degree of fear that congressional Republicans felt on the issue of Social Security, and the only chance a deal had of working would be if Speaker Gingrich was able to convince members of his conference that having President Clinton and his popularity on board would neutralize the issue for them. And clearly, once President Clinton was weaker, any chance of that being a successful political strategy was undercut. So I think it did more to scare away Republicans who wanted to make a deal with him but no longer thought it would work politically than as much as it did on the Democratic side. And finally, one last anecdote on the impeachment scandal. The morning after when the news first broke, there was a meeting of those of us in the Payne caucus. I don't remember the exact purpose of the meeting, but it was a very sober meeting. And I remember Chuck being a very good Republican, being as disappointed and discouraged by the news as any Democrat, not because obviously he's a good Republican that he was upset about Bill Clinton's future, but because I think he sensed immediately, as we all have seen, as Erskine Bowles said, that was a seminal moment in American history, that the prospects for Social Security reform were very close, but that the moment that article came out in the Washington Post and everything that followed, that the effort continued for another year after that, but the chances of it succeeding were much, much dimmer.
Thank you guys very much. I just have one quick question for the three of you, then I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. We've heard a lot of talk recently, especially in the last year, about starting another entitlement commission or some type of commission to deal with Social Security, Medicare, and other problems. I count there were 4 Social Security commissions under Clinton. In your opinions, did they sort of have any effect in advancing the debate, and are these worthwhile?
Well, I think that the 94-95 Advisory Commission helped advance the idea not by creating the political consensus, but by putting the ideas forward and putting issues forward and ways of thinking it that then the political actors were able to work from. That I think all of us who were putting together Social Security reform proposals in the mid-90s, and that would apply to folks in the administration as well as Republican leadership and centrist groups, were looking at the concepts and elements that they developed. I don't think that the work of that commission was a substitute for the political consensus that was necessary, and I think that would still require the degree of a deal, whether it be the deal along the lines that President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich were getting, or some other deal. I think the example of the 1983 commission was that only succeeded because you had political actors making a political deal and the commission filled in the details. So I think all the commissions in the 90s helped advance the debate forward on a policy level and an intellectual level, but not necessarily on a political level.
I would agree with that. I think the commissions can serve a purpose if they clarify the options, and then if there's the political will to make choices. And I think, I forget who it was, I think maybe it was Bruce Reed who said to me, the economics of Social Security are much less complicated than the politics of Social Security, and commissions usually deal with the policy, but policy separate from the politics will not advance the agenda very far. And I think what was unique about the 90s was you had the intersection of commissions that showed that there was some common ground, and it was a bipartisan common ground, and you had political actors who were willing to act on those options and to move the agenda forward. But simply having a commission without having political will we'll just produce more paper and more sort of volumes in a library that, like most of my books, just sit and collect dust.
Okay,
I can offer or not offer.
sure, go ahead.
Well, I basically agree with what's been said. I think that I agree with Ed that a commission doesn't necessarily have to produce the political result to form an important function in terms of developing options. I think both Carrie Danforth Commission and the Social Security Advisory Council, neither of which could come to agreement, did certainly add a lot of useful information in advancing the debate, even though obviously that's not the sort of commission you would hope for if you were at the brink of a problem and need action right away. The three elements that make a commission successful, of course, are: do they provide adequate cover for legislators? Do they have adequate buy-in from legislators? And do they have the ability to reach compromise between themselves? And obviously the different commissions that have been constructed over the last couple of decades have all had different balances of those attributes and had different degrees of success as a result.
We'll now take questions from the audience. I ask you to please introduce yourself and try to keep it to a question. Back.
Michael Ryan with DNA. This is for Chuck and Ed. Last week, the American Academy of Actuaries sponsored a Capitol Hill staff briefing on Social Security reform and declared that Social Security was not a financial problem, it was a demographic one, and proposed three separate ideas about how to address that. The biggest one addressing 50% of the cost of the program. I just want to get your response to that statement.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't actually seen their report or their briefing. I think it's hard to separate it between a demographic and a financial problem. It is, to some extent, both, and it becomes a value judgment on which of the two you view it as. If you view it purely as a demographic problem, and then you can maybe be willing to accept that a growing share of our resources will go to the elderly population, and so it's a matter simply of meeting those demographic challenges and shifting resources, or changing the underlying social contract and with delays in retirement age or other changes that would say that the percentage of lifetime spent in retirement would be smaller. But I think it is the value judgments you make about how much of a demographic problem is and how much you want to accept those demographic realities within the current policies becomes a financial problem. And you can either pay to maintain the current promises with the current demographic group, or we have to make changes. So I don't think you can say it's a demographic challenge and not a financial problem. It's somewhat of both, depending on how you view the situation.
I'm obviously not in a position to speak to the specific policy recommendations that the actuaries made. I do think that certainly they have performed a useful role in pointing out the demographic basis for the Social Security shortfall. Borrowing a little bit from Ed, I would say you can say there's two dimensions to the problem. One is the demographic change, the fact that the ratio of workers to collectors is dropping. The other is the fact that we have a system that is effectively a pay-as-you-go system. Demographic change would be less of an issue if we had a fully funded system, for example, and each generation was funding their own retirement. In a pay-as-you-go system where one generation's retirement is being paid for by the generation that follows, it's much more sensitive to demographic change. So it's the interaction of demographics and the nature of Social Security financing that produces the problem, in my view.
Rochelle Friedman with the Coalition on Human Needs. My question has to do with what you deal with jointly and what you might deal with separately. It's my sense that the Medicare problem is much nearer term and much more serious financially than Social Security. I'm wondering if the panel thinks that we should deal with each of these separately, or if somehow we should do broader entitlement reform that relates to health and Social Security in one effort.
I think there's no clear right answer to that question, but I would say a couple things that were motivating us in the 90s to focus on Social Security and focus on Social Security the way that we did in the proposals that we'd worked on from the center. One is that the policy choices are pretty clear on Social Security, that you can go to CBO or to the actuaries and ask for a menu of changes, and you can have, with a relative degree of certainty, you push these buttons, you pull these levers, you're going to get these results. There are political choices that are behind all those that are difficult, and they're not all completely clear-cut, but by and large, there's a very distinct menu, and you have a good idea what the results are going to be. On healthcare, we have policies that have widely different opinions on how successful they would be in controlling costs, in effect, making changes. So on Social Security, it is possible to sit together and pick a menu of choices and have a great degree of certainty what that's going to mean for revenues and Social Security going forward. On healthcare, there's going to be inevitably a certain degree of trial and error, and we're going to have to be enacting policies that we hope will have savings. We have some reason to believe would achieve savings, but no great degree of confidence would actually get savings. And I don't think you'd ever be able to get any analyst to be able to say with any degree of honesty they could do that. So part of the reason for moving with Social Security is let's act in where we have a good sense of what the policy choices are and have a good sense that the policy choices are going to work, whereas the healthcare reform, dealing with have those costs, may 10 years from now have the curve bent significantly, but we may find ourselves 10 years from now where those policies not as successful and we've faced those large costs still in place. The other thing I think that motivated us in my remarks was talking about how what motivated us on Social Security was limiting the amount of the share that Social Security placed on the entire economy was in part recognition of how hard it was going to be to get our hands around the healthcare costs and the fact that inevitably healthcare costs and by extension therefore Medicare and Medicaid are going to be growing faster than the economy, and that as a society we probably would want to make that choice. But if we're going to be making that choice of allowing one part of the budget to be growing faster than the economy, maybe not, obviously not as much as it wanted to, that made it even more important that we try to be restraining the other part of the program. And to the extent that either be surpluses or new revenues could be going into Social Security, do we want to be committing all those revenues to Social Security, knowing that there are these needs on health care that we're going to be facing as well.
Steve,
Yeah, I just wanted I tell you that when Clinton and Gingrich sat down in '97, they decided to separate the two issues. They felt that as complicated as Social Security was, they felt they could see their way through, and they had hoped to be able to push something through by the following December or so. They put Medicare on a much slower track because they thought it was going to be a lot more complicated, both in terms of policy choices and the politics. They set up a commission. They asked John Grove to be the chair of the commission, but they felt that they could get a handle. They could deal with Social Security. They thought Medicare was going to be a lot more complicated, so they put it on a much slower track.
I would just say I think we should do as much as we can when we can. I think the chances right now of getting a solution to Medicare for all time are nil. Medicare is, by its very nature, such a big problem. We're going to be doing incremental reforms for a while. So we make a big mistake if we let that hold us back from fixing Social Security. I certainly agree that Medicare is the larger problem in the aggregate, and certainly over the longer run. I would like to challenge a bit of the trend of popular opinion about the relative severity of the Social Security and Medicare problems, though, at least in the near term. Social Security actually is the sooner problem. Even though Medicare has a higher growth rate, Social Security costs in the aggregate over the next decade are actually going to grow more than Medicare. So a lot of people don't realize that. Medicare, even under its projected very high growth rates, as seen by the trustees, will not surpass Social Security in size for another 2 decades yet. So Social Security is the more immediate of the problem. It's at least as large over the next couple of decades, and it's the one we can more easily solve right now.
I'm going to put in a little advertisement here. A week from today, the National Press Club will be having an event from the New America Foundation on what the real entitlement problem is, demographics or healthcare. So check out newamerica.net. Any more questions? Virginia?
Yeah, Virginia Reno with the National Academy of Social Insurance. Thank you all. My question is really to invite a comment from all three of you on what I had understood to be the fiscal policy rationale of the Clinton administration when they talked about saving Social Security first. It was my understanding what they were saying is don't cut taxes in the rest of the budget. Instead, balance the rest of the budget so that the surplus in Social Security can be used to reduce the federal debt, thereby reducing future interest obligations, making it somewhat more affordable for future generations to pay somewhat more for the pay-as-you-go cost of Social Security. That was my understanding what they were talking about, and I didn't hear that mentioned this morning. So.
Well, I would, that certainly was part of the rationale, but a very important part of the proposal. Well, let me step back a bit. Social Security is already accounted for as though it is credited for its contribution to reducing publicly held debt. So, for example, if someone were to say, let's use the Social Security surplus to pay down debt, it will make it easier for us to finance the program's annual cash deficits when they arrive in 2017, and make it easier to carry forward to 2041. So, for example, if we could build a time machine, go back, use the Social Security surplus to pay down government debt, then you could make a case we were in pretty good shape up through 2041. That wasn't the only element of their proposal. What they did, as Ed noted in his remarks, was to propose a second round of credits to Social Security. So we would basically credit it a second time for its role in reducing publicly held debt and extending solvency well into the 2050s by doing that. So Social Security is already credited under current law with principal and interest as though we were using that money to build saving. And then they would say, well, if we now actually use it to do that, we're going to credit it a second time. So my own view is that sort of the fiscal gains of actually responsibly using the Social Security surplus to pay down debt would be then turned around and handed back out the window by making an equal number of commitments through issuance of debt through the trust fund to extend solvency, at least on paper, through the 2050s. It was essentially a double round of credits for the same economic purpose.
I just would note that actually the Clinton administration, when the surpluses got bigger, revised their proposal somewhat, that to the extent we truly were balanced in the budget without Social Security surpluses and had a unified surplus equal to Social Security surplus, that basically makes the trust fund more real in an economic sense, in that at that point, those surpluses that are being credited to the Social Security Trust Fund are real savings. And so that part of saving Social Security first, and when it was simply making sure that the Social Security budget was going to be balanced without using Social Security, would make the surpluses that we were counting on. But again, as Chuck mentioned in his remarks, that only gets you to 2041. And saving Social Security first from 98 forward wouldn't have accounted for all the surpluses that were credited to Social Security in the previous 15 years, but not truly saved in any economic sense. So I think, as I said, saving the surpluses was a important and I think necessary first step towards dealing with the long-term problems. But it wasn't going to be a complete solution, and to some extent was sort of oversold as a solution, as opposed to maybe making the problem closer to what people really thought it was. If we thought the system was fine until 2041, saving the surpluses just made sure it wasn't actually worse than that.
The origin of that phrase, actually, as I understand it, it was John Hilley, who was the president's congressional liaison, who came up with it in a meeting in the fall. And it was a political slogan designed to freeze the discussion until the administration could figure out what their Social Security strategy was going to be. And the problem they faced in the fall, when obviously there was all this discussion about what to do with the surplus, they were afraid that the Republicans were going to enact large tax cuts. So they came up with that slogan as a way of preventing the Republicans from doing anything with the budget, coming up with a politically appealing slogan that would freeze the debate until they could figure out exactly what their Social Security policy was going to be.
Okay, well, I have another question. Let's bring this back to policy a little bit. At the time when Clinton and Gingrich were negotiating, we know they were negotiating over the retirement age and sort of over using the surpluses. What do you think are sort of the low-hanging fruits today, and in sort of your discussions in the 90s? What are the areas of Social Security reform where there seems to be at least some level of agreement?
I wish there was. I think even the low-hanging fruit, we need a couple ladders to find. I do think that some degree of change in the retirement age or indexing benefits to life expectancy, where maybe you could continue retiring close to the normal age, but getting smaller benefits so that the amount of income you get over your retired lives would be constant, I think is definitely an area in which there's, on an intellectual level, a degree of consensus, with details having to be worked about where retirement age doesn't work for everyone. I think there was, at a point, seemed to be movement towards a consensus that more accurate cost of living adjustments, to the extent that there was evidence that the consumer price index overstated inflation, was a place where there seemed to be moved towards consensus, but and low-hanging fruit. But every of the options and ideas that has, no matter how strong the policy rationale, there's very significant political impacts of that and very significant real-world impacts that make it far from low-hanging fruit. I'm not sure that there's anything I would necessarily characterize as low-hanging fruit at this point.
Could I give a sort of two-part answer to the question, which is that first part would be where I would, first of all, I don't know where the low-hanging fruit is, I agree with that. I can tell you where I would look for it. I would look for it in places where the debate has not already been polarized or very energetically discussed. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about everything price indexing to progressive indexing to raising the retirement age, to raising the cap on taxable wages. It might be fruitful for people very quietly who are looking to create bipartisan cooperation to look in places that have not been subject to that same degree of partisan exchange. You know, everything from the actuarial adjustments for early retirement, delayed retirement, to the coupling of the system's progressivity with its average index monthly earnings formula. There's all sorts of aspects of the Social Security benefit structure that haven't been as polarized in discussion, and I would, and many of them have to do with incentivizing people to retire early or to retire late. Because we have a need for people to be working longer, and because those areas haven't been as polarized yet, that might be a fruitful, no pun intended, place to search. Second part, I would say what we can do is we can look at the comprehensive proposals that have been put forward and see what elements they have in common. When I do that, however, I principally come up with principles that are things we shouldn't do. Don't change benefits for current near-term retirees seems to be an element in common. Don't, to the extent you can avoid it, change benefits at all for people in the bottom 25-30% of the wage distribution. Spread the burdens of attaining solvency among the upper 2/3 to 3/4 of the wage distribution. Again, there's going to be a vigorous discussion about whether that should be done on the benefit side or the revenue side, but obviously that's where we're going to have to target changes. I will say two things here that I suspect will be controversial among some, but I'll say them anyway because I believe it. I haven't seen a proposal in Congress that attains sustainable solvency that doesn't have personal accounts in there somewhere. So I still think that's an element that is an important part of the deal. If it weren't, then we'd see some proposals that lack them. And fourth, I also am a believer in the Lewinsky-Samwick approach, that if you are going to put additional revenues into the system, they shouldn't go into the trust fund, because I think there is too great of a concern on both sides of the aisle about the experience of the 83 reforms and the government's failure to save that money.
And I can take up a few things. I was remiss in not mentioning the raising the taxable cap as something that people do consider part of low-hanging fruit. It clearly is one of the options that has more appeal, but I think with that option and a lot of other options, it's hard to do many things piecemeal because it's going to be viewed by people on both sides of how it fits in the overall context. So raising the taxable wage cap could be something that could be part of a bipartisan agreement if there was agreement on what was being done with those revenues. I think a lot of the benefit changes that it's impossible to make those in isolation without knowing what's happening to the rest of the benefit package. I think there are conditions in which there are increases in the retirement age or life expectancy indexing could be easier to sell if the rest of the package had a robust enough safety net and dealt with other issues on its own. Probably not. So it's not something that can be done easily incrementally where you can say, well, we don't know the full solution. We can do these one or two policies now with it a little bit, because I think it's selling in, it's going to depend on how it fits in the overall package.
Noah Meyerson in Personal Budget Office. I was wondering if anybody thinks it's possible to get anything through if you don't have a divided government. I think one argument that's been come up is the political argument that you need a divided government so each side can blame the other. And the other thing I think from a sort of more substantive point is that the party that's not in power is going to be very skeptical that they would have the ability to get something that's worth passing. One argument I've heard from responsible Democrats during the last few years is, yes, we need to work on fix Social Security, we should do it right away. But if we did it right away, then we're going to have an awful plan from the Bush administration. It's better to wait, which we shouldn't do, but get a better plan later than have a bad, what they saw as a bad plan now. So, pessimistic opening, but hopefully you'll have some.
I raised that issue in my comments. Let me respond to it. My sense is, and those of you who live in Washington and work here, especially policy perspective, a better sense of this than I. But it seems that this is a process that's been going on for some 30 years. It seems to be intensifying over the past 10 years, where the parties become increasingly polarized, and the center of gravity for the parties have moved. The Republican Party has moved further to the right, the Democratic Party further to the left. A lot of change, a lot of things have played into that. Talking about the media, the movement of the once solid South, the once solid Democratic South and the Republican South. Both parties, until the 1960s and the 1970s, had more competing elements that were a part of their coalition. There used to be a thing called liberal Republicans. And so I think the parties, the center of gravity in the parties have moved either to the right or to the left. So that if you had, as you have had in the past, during great reform efforts, with the exception of the progressive period, a one party that controls all the branches of government, you're going to have a party that is either further to the left or further to the right than parties have been traditionally in the past. And I think with something like Social Security reform, which involves difficult policy choices, that my sense is that you're more likely to get it if you can bring together a coalition of moderates in the Republican Party and moderates in the Democratic Party, and isolate the extremes of both parties. And I think you're more likely to get that in an instance where you have divided government, where both parties can see a buy-in. And what happened in 1997-98 was Gingrich wanted to hold the Congress. He wanted to hold the House. And he felt he had a better chance of doing that if he could prove that he had something to demonstrate, that there were some legislative achievements that allowed him to maintain the House. Clinton believed that those same legislative achievements would help the Democrats continue holding the White House. So they had they had their legacies involved, they had mutual political calculation involved, and both parties had a buy-in. Both parties were making politically costly compromises so that you essentially prevent one from attacking the other. And so I think, my sense is that given the highly partisan and polarized environment in Washington today, that unlike in the past, the only way you're going to achieve something is to create that type of a neutral environment where neither side will attack each other, rather than having a situation where one party dominates all branches of government.
I have some experience with the phenomenon that you talked about. What happens when you try to move Social Security? You have a minority party in both houses that doesn't feel any inclination or buy-in. So I certainly recognize the truth of what you're talking about and the virtue of divided government in certain circumstances. But I'd make some additional observations. I think a famous person once said, you have to fix Social Security with the government that you have. Sooner or later, we're going to have to fix Social Security, and it may happen at a time of unified government, it may happen at a time of divided government, but it's going to have to happen. So I think we need to put aside hoping for the optimal political alignment and take note of the substantive reality that becomes more difficult and more unfair to fix Social Security every year we wait to do it. Finally, I just offer the observation that what matters in the end is less party affiliation and more people. What mattered in the 1990s wasn't that Bill Clinton was a Democrat, it was that he was a Democrat who was willing to work on fixing Social Security. What mattered wasn't that Newt Gingrich was a Republican, he was a Republican who was willing to work with President Clinton to try to fix Social Security. What matters is whether the incoming president and the incoming Congress are willing on a personal level to put aside their party affiliations and do what is in the interest of future generations. And we can't lose sight of that.
I would agree with what Chuck just said. It wouldn't be wise of me to suggest whether divided government is good or not, because obviously from where I sit now, there's only one government alignment that is acceptable. But what I would say is that having bipartisanship, and whether it be from a minority party of the opposite party of the president or majority party, I think having a bipartisan buy-in and bipartisan agreement is important, not just for the reasons that Dr. Gillon mentioned, although those are important, but also for the sustainability of a policy and the ability then to reach those compromises that I think neither party is going to be willing to make the tough choices that are necessary to get for a Social Security deal if they are afraid it's going to be undone by the other party if the other party is in charge. And so what Democrats aren't going to by any means be willing to make tough choices to control, restrain Social Security if all that's going to do is free up money that then Republicans use for tax cuts and undo any of the good things that Social Democrats had on the benefit side. And I think the same would be true on the Republican side, that Republican members aren't going to go along with tough choices and maybe look at raising the tax base or other tough choices if they thought that the other side was just going to pocket those and Democrats were going to pocket those changes and undo all the reforms they thought were necessary. So I think whether it be in a divided government or single-party government, I think you would need to have buy-in from both parties, minority and majority in Congress, not just to make it politically viable, but also just to get to the deal and have both sides know that that's going to last and not be undone by the next election.
I'm back.
Yeah, on the discussion of low-hanging fruit, one item I noticed nobody discussed was the coverage of state and local government employees. Currently, there's about 3 to 5 million, maybe you can correct me on the number, that are not covered by Social Security that could be brought into the system.
Funny you should mention that as low-hanging fruit. Chuck and I both once thought it was low-hanging fruit, much to our detriment. That the original Colby Stenholm, Greg Bro plan put together by the National Commission on Retirement Policy included that as an element in there. And when we were looking at options, and we gave them, members of the commission, the whole menu of policy options, that was one that everyone checked of a no-brainer, obvious, good choice. And then as the members of Congress we worked for introduced those plans, we suddenly started hearing John Burrow, happening from Louisiana, a state that isn't covered, suddenly decided this wasn't as much a low-hanging fruit, and working for a member from Texas where the school teachers aren't covered, we also discovered it wasn't quite the low-hanging fruit. So when we updated the plan, what was clearly from all the policy wonk perspective, a low-hanging fruit, obvious choice, was probably near the bottom of the things that most of the political advisors would have told us was a wise choice. And that's a very illustrative example of why it's difficult, of why you can sit around a table of policy wonks and construct a plan, but then come up with something that members of Congress can introduce and pass. I think that's still something that's probably likely to be need to be part of discussion, but it's not nearly as easy as it may seem.
Yes, Guy. What are the consequences of doing absolutely nothing about Social Security in terms of all the options you discussed, and in light of Professor Gillon's research?
The obvious consequence of doing nothing is just that the system becomes more and more expensive and places a higher and higher burden on wage earners and their employers. Technically, if you do nothing, what happens is you hit the cash deficit point in 2017, according to the trustees. CBO says 2019. At that point, you have to start coming up with more and more additional revenues, general revenues, to redeem the debt held by the trust fund. The cost rises from about 11 cents of every taxable dollar that workers earn today to closer to 17 cents in about a generation. So when you couple that and along with corresponding cost growth in Medicare, you're talking about roughly 1/3 of the taxable wages of workers going to fund 2 programs alone. Obviously, this would have very detrimental effects for our profitability and our economic growth.
And I would just say that I don't think that it's a question of that Congress won't ultimately act at some point to deal with. The question is going to be when, and what are the options available, and what are the opportunity costs. That if we wait till we get closer to 2041, first of all, we will have been squeezing everything else in the federal budget in order to redeem it, and by the time we get close to the edge, the choices are going to be very massive benefit cuts or very massive and immediate tax increases. And the longer you wait, the more narrow those choices become, and then all the opportunity costs that you have of everything else we might have done if Social Security wasn't continuing on its current trajectory and running those deficits, is something we'll never know, but it'll be what we aren't able to do as much as then what the pain will be when we ultimately do have to act. I don't think that we're going to let the trust fund completely depleted, but the choices that policymakers would face if we wait till that point are going to be much more dire than they would be if we were to act now. And I think one of the obvious ones is that if we're waiting till the end, there's no way the solution doesn't affect current retirees. The closer we get to 2041, the harder that just becomes mathematically possible to do.
Any more questions? Any comments from the panel? Questions to each other? All right, thank you everyone for coming. I want to mention the Pact is on sale outside again, and come to our event.
I didn't tell them to say that.